Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of I Believe Now What, where we talk about that now what that comes after we believe. The main mission of this channel is just to give glory to God, bring things up so that way we don't, sadly, a lot of the stuff does tend to be negative, but that's so we don't repeat the history, the bad history, things of that nature. Learn from those mistakes, learn from those things. And that's an example of what I want to talk about today. So, if you couldn't tell by the thumbnail and the title, it's not a gotcha thumbnail or anything. We're going to talk about NDAs or non disclosure agreements. If you are not new to this channel, you probably already know what I'm talking about. But if you are new, you're going to see here that we've covered a lot of churches, sadly, that have had scandals and things of that nature. And in that, they were trying to use NDAs, non disclosure agreements, to basically silence people from speaking up. And in my opinion, I'm just going to tell you straight up and answer the question right now. I do not believe churches should be using NDAs whatsoever. There are some nuances when it comes to that, but there's also really good alternatives. And we're going to talk about that as we get into the episode. But just overall, NDAs, secret things, keeping things covered up and secret and hidden and away from the light is just not a practice that I believe the church should be doing. And when you have big, giant churches, especially little churches can do this too, but especially big, giant churches, because that's normally where you're going to see them because they involve money and all these other things. This is honestly what happens when your church is ran more like a corporation instead of the universal body of Christ of believers, get the believers gathering together and worshiping God. Let's go ahead and lay this down on the foundation of scripture. So first I want to bring up two passages specifically. First, Proverbs chapter 28 verse 13, where it says, "He who conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion." Now, a couple key things. One, talking about concealing transgressions, that's what NDAs are. They're basically concealing transgressions that have happened. Now, there's other purposes and other uses for them. Once again, we're going to talk about that, but mainly in the context of church, we see it a lot when you're trying to cover up a scandal or something like that. And that's concealing your transgression. But then it says, "He who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion." Now, I will argue that confessing and forsaking, the confessing, I believe that is to God and God alone. I do think if you are in a leadership position, you do have a responsibility to confess things out to your congregation, to the people who listen to you, whether that be in your actual local church assembly, or if you have an online ministry, say like myself, you would have to go ahead and confess that out to the public. And the cool thing is about Christians is we're all about forgiveness. I don't know why you wouldn't want to confess it. Now, are you qualified to do certain things anymore? No, but you have that weight off your shoulders. So confess and forsake, that's the other key word, forsaking, or in other words, saying, I do not want to go that way again. I don't want to ever purposely do this sin ever again. Next, I want to take us over to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 through 14, where it says, "The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring," and this is really key right here, "for God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil." So even if an NDA gets signed, and say there's some major ministry leader out there, they pass away, an NDA was signed in the past, nobody ever knows. God knows. And that's what truly matters. And one day you will be judged for that. Now, if you're a Christian, it's not going to be a heaven and hell judgment. But I, for one, do not want to stand in front of Jesus Christ and have to wear that type of shame or anything like that on me. Granted, there's a whole bunch of nuances that we can get deeper into it, but just imagine seeing Jesus right there in front of you. He took that sin on for you. I don't even want to picture it. So let's go ahead and we keep moving on to this. Mainly what I wanted to what kind of spark this was this article that came out from the Christian Post. And it just kind of made me think about all the different times that on this channel we have covered something like this and NDAs were either involved or trying to get involved. This person right here is Cindy Clemenshire. If you're familiar with her, she is the woman who Robert Morris, he essayed her when she was 12 years old. And eventually she came out, contacted him, wanted him to pay the legal fees that she had to go through for the mental trauma that he caused to her. And it was somewhere around $50,000 for somebody who makes $117 million, net worth, like Robert Morris at that time. $50,000 isn't that much. Plus, it's the right thing to do. You traumatized her. You should pay for her counseling fees, things of that nature. That's all she wanted. He said, "No, I'll give you $25,000 and I will have make you sign an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement, meaning you cannot go public with what uh, I did to you." Now, let's just kind of go over first what exactly an NDA is. So, an NDA, and I'm reading here from my notes, a non disclosure agreement is a legal contract used to protect sensitive information or trade secrets from being disclosed to unauthorized parties. It creates confidential relationships between parties to protect shared information. NDAs are commonly used in a business setting, but can apply to many other contexts where private information is exchanged, and we'll go ahead and give a little bit of an in-depth breakdown. So once again, for the most part, you see this being used in business. And what I picture this as is maybe a company has developed some, amazing way to develop their product and they don't want anybody else to find out about it, but they need to bring on more researchers, things of that nature. So when they go ahead and do a job interview, they'll go ahead and make that person sign an NDA saying that they will not disclose this or else legal repercussions will happen to that person. That's what I imagine an NDA should be for. Once again, not something I think for the church setting. So there's two types of NDAs out there, really three types. Sorry, not two types, three types. And there's a unilateral NDA, which involves one party agreeing not to disclose certain information. This is common where a business shares confidential information with a potential employee, consultant, investor, like I just mentioned. A mutual NDA, where both parties agree to protect each other's confidential information. Then a multilateral NDA, which involves more than two parties or two and more parties agreeing to protect shared information. This is usually used in complex negotiations and things like that. So that's basically the different types of NDAs that you see out there. Mainly what you see with the church NDAs, at least in the ones that we've covered with scandals, is that unilateral where one party agrees not to disclose certain information. So key elements of an NDA, just keep in mind that it needs to be well drafted. They have to be very, very specific. Usually you're going to have lawyers in the process of this, and that costs money. And this is why I say mostly you're going to see NDAs come out of mega churches, because if you've ever been to a smaller church, most smaller churches do not have the funds to be able to afford all these expensive lawyers and draft up these documents and things of that nature. Some might, but for the most part, absolutely no. It's not going to be there. So you usually see it out of the mega church world where they bring in a lot of money and they can actually afford this stuff. And they see something happen, say their pastor slept with someone that wasn't their wife, and they know that this is going to be detrimental to the church as a business, sadly. And they will hire on a lawyer because they think drafting up these documents and doing all these legal things and paying all these fees and paying this hush money and whatnot is going to be much more beneficial than having this leak out. That's kind of my little take on it right there. So now, one of the things that I was discovering when I was reading through was the actual enforceability of NDAs. For an NDA to be enforceable, certain conditions must be met. One, legal consideration. Both parties must gain something of value from the agreement, i.e., access to information or compensation for non-disclosure. Let's go back to the Cindy Clemishire case. Robert Morris was offering her $25,000. That's what she would get. And then, of course, Robert Morris would get him not having to have public embarrassment for what he did, all those years ago. Next, specificity. The NDA must be clearly defined what is considered confidential and what actions are prohibited. This is why you probably get lawyers involved, because you have to get really specific. Okay, could Cindy not go to any public media? Could she go to, could she tell a friend? Could she tell a family member? All these different things. You could just imagine how complex this probably gets. And then lastly, reasonable terms. The restrictions imposed by the NDA should be reasonable in terms of scope, duration, and geography, because you have to make it reasonable. Like, is this a lifetime ban here? Is this a 20-year ban, 25-year ban until the pastor dies or something like that? Who knows? Courts are more likely to enforce NDAs with balanced, fair terms. And then lastly, good faith. Both parties must sign the NDA in good faith with no intent to defraud or mislead the other party. Now, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to NDAs as well. They're not bulletproof. NDAs do not prevent breaches from occurring. They provide legal recourse if something does occur. So, say if you were Cindy Clemishire, you signed the NDA saying you couldn't go public. I'm assuming that's what it was. And she does go public. Well, Robert Morris could have taken her to court and sued her because she violated the NDA. Now, it's difficult in some cases to prove a breach. Demonstrating that the confidential information was disclosed in violation of the NDA can sometimes be difficult, especially if the information can be independently developed or found in public sources. So, if somebody else got a hold of this information and pushed it out there, somebody that she told in the past or something like that, then, Cindy, by all means, would have been completely, and I just keep using this as an example, she would have been completely fine if that was the case. Of course, we know Cindy never signed the NDA, just to let you all know. And then lastly, the enforcement costs. So legal actions to enforce NDAs can be expensive, especially in cross-border situations, international type stuff. That is basically what we're seeing out of this when it comes to NDAs. So why would a church ever decide to use an NDA? So first off, you have something, and this is some of the outside stuff that I wasn't thinking of initially, but counseling and pastoral care. As a pastor, you will be counseling people sometimes, and they will share very private, personal information with you. Maybe an NDA gets signed. Now, that is not the norm. I just want to say that I was looking up possible considerations for an NDA in the church. That is not the norm. There's other documents that you can use. There's other things, confidentiality agreements that you can use. Say for an example, a chaplain in the United States Army is they basically sign a non-disclosure agreement, but not really a non-disclosure agreement. They have 100% confidentiality. So whatever you tell that chaplain, that Army chaplain, they cannot tell anybody else. That's what the Army Chaplain Corps does, is they have 100% confidentiality. And there's other documents that you can use besides NDAs to do that. Once again, for all the other reasons, NDAs being very, very expensive and all the other things that go into consideration with them. But a situation could be the counseling and pastoral care if there is some real sensitive information in there. You have employment agreements where churches, and Stephen Furtick apparently was a part of this before. Usually volunteers from his church, or at least it was said. He never admitted it, but at least it was said from past volunteers that Elevation Church would make their volunteers sign non-disclosure agreements to protect the church's internal processes, intellectual property, decision making, and really just whatever the case may be. Other things that you see could be, when this is the one that we really see the majority of, is controversies and scandals. A lot of churches will use the NDA, mega churches will use the NDA when it comes to these controversies and scandals. Shelley writes, my church made us sign a form at the end of a small group leader training that we'd, quote, protect the senior leaders and all other leaders no matter the cost. Yeah, see, that's cultish. And I believe, Shelley, you said in the past that you were part of an ARC church, or an association of related churches, I believe it was. Correct me if I'm wrong. I have heard plenty of controversies when it comes to those churches, and then almost like vigorously defending. Even there was a volunteer video for Elevation Church, which isn't an ARC church, but similar practices, where they said, Elevation Church was built on Pastor Stephen Furtick's vision, and we will aggressively defend that vision. Like almost like he's elevated above, like his words are like the words of God or whatever. Like, no, your church is not built on a person's vision. The church should be built on Jesus Christ, which the true church is. And it's so sad that, Shelley, that this was going on. And yeah, these are deceitful church practices that you see, because then this is kind of setting the stage and grooming for abuse and other things of that nature, covering up and whatnot. D. Cole asked, does that include crimes? And I'm glad you asked that, because I did do some research into it, and I didn't get to it in my notes yet, but I'll go ahead and bring it up since you asked, D. Cole. So crimes, NDAs do not prevent somebody from reporting a crime. Let's just go ahead back to the Robert Morris, Cindy Clemishire case. If she decided to report that crime and it was still within the statute of limitations, and she reported that crime to the police, she has not violated that NDA. Now, how the police go public with that and all this kind of, that's going to be a whole nother story. Let's just say the NDA said she wasn't allowed to go public to media, et cetera, and so on. they can't prevent her from going to the police to report the crime because that is the law. Now, states vary from state to state from what I heard, but from the majority, I think almost all the states do have that. You can't have somebody sign an NDA where they can't report a crime that has happened. I'm pretty confident about that. So as we go through the different type of churches we see with NDAs, once again, we see employee NDAs, volunteer NDAs. Once again, Stephen Furtick's church, I think, was known for that. Conflict resolution NDAs, counseling and confidentiality agreements, and this is where we get into the concerns and the ethical questions and dilemmas. So transparency versus confidentiality. I believe churches are supposed to be 100% transparent. We should not be hiding anything. Paul in Romans talks about the Christian and the law, saying, hey, if you do the law, you have no reason to fear the government. You have no reason to fear the authorities because you're doing what is right. You're doing what is good. As a church, if you should have no reason to fear things getting out into public light that you don't want out there if you're not doing them. So I don't believe, once again, another reason churches should not be using NDAs. We should be transparent in everything that we do. One, so people can see what we are like as Christians, see the light of Christ shining out from us, but at the same time also know, hey, we're not entirely perfect people, and we don't want to make the claim that we are perfect. Our perfection is found in Jesus Christ, period. Christ is our perfection. We strive for Christ likeness while we're in this earth, and we have been saved by him, but we're not perfect. Transparency should be head over heels, one of the biggest things when it comes to the church. This is why I'm so against churches uh, tax exempt status. Not the full thing. I think churches should be tax exempt status. I think it's a good thing, but I do believe that they should be transparent in their financial practices. Like, you have to fill out where all this money is going. There should be no hiding the fact that the church is laundering money by just like a report we read a few months ago, where a church was essentially buying up property, beachside property, and then selling it to the pastors for super cheap prices. And then the pastors go ahead and sell that themselves for the market price. And just all of a sudden, boom, pastor's got $1 million now. That's money laundering. That's wrong. But churches can hide that because they don't have to file all that information in their 990s. And I think churches should post all that stuff in the 990s. When we see NDAs in practice, it's usually to silence victims. It's used to silence people, either because somebody was victimized or because there's some shady things going on in that church and they don't want people to know about it. We see it with church leadership. We see it with maybe high donors inside the church, things of that nature. You got moral and biblical considerations that you also got to take in, which we already kind of discussed about. But I truly believe that NDAs in of himself, going back to the verses that we were talking about in Proverbs 28:13, he who conceals his transgressions will not prosper. It's not right. Churches should not be using this practice. Now, going to the enforceability of church NDAs, I want to go through a couple different notes that I generated up here. So NDAs in churches are legally enforceable, just like any other organization. And if an individual breaches the NDA, the church may pursue legal remedies such as damages or injunctive relief to prevent further disclosure. And I tell you what, how petty would that be? Let's just say there is let's use a different example. Let's say there's a pastor of a church and he has some very abusive practices. He hasn't done anything, sexually perverse or anything like that, but just very abusive practices to his staff, things of that nature. And he makes every single employee, staff employee, and volunteer sign a non-disclosure agreement saying, hey, anything that you see Pastor so-and-so doing, you are not allowed to speak to anybody public about it. And if you do, we're going to take you to court. How petty does it seem if a church takes somebody to court? Other things to keep into consideration: religious freedom considerations. While religious institutions enjoy certain legal protections under the U.S. Constitution and other jurisdiction laws, there are still subject to general contract law. If an NDA is deemed to be overly restrictive or unethical, i.e., silencing abuse victims, it may be challenged in court. So it's hard to enforce those, especially in those abuse situations. Then you have the ethical enforcement. Courts may be hesitant to enforce NDAs that involve church abuse or misconduct if they are perceived as protecting harmful behavior. In some cases, the public interest in exposing wrongdoing may outweigh the church's interest in confidentiality. Now, mind you, this is all coming in the court setting, the courtroom setting. Mega churches have a lot of money. They can hire fancy lawyers. You, on the other hand, now there are lawyers out there like pro bono lawyers that help out church abuse victims, things of that nature. When it comes to the money wise, though, this is really, really expensive stuff. Susie writes, there's some should be some level of confidentiality during counseling situations to provide trust with the counselor, but it should never be expected that a victim stays quiet about a crime against them. And Susie, I completely agree with you. I don't have the exact research. I didn't make too many notes on it, but when I was researching, there are other things besides NDAs too that you can use when it comes to counseling to show that there is confidentiality when you are talking about things that are a trust statement, basically that the pastor will not go and share all this personal information that you are kind of pouring out to that pastor. There are other things out there besides NDAs. Once again, very expensive that do that. But and there should be some. Excuse me, drinking my water a little too fast. There should be some type of confidentiality for those counseling situations, just like you mentioned. So now I kind of want to go through some alternatives, like I talked about, when it comes to those NDAs. So you have confidentiality clauses in employee handbooks sometimes, especially for staff members. Rather than reading my notes here, rather than requiring standalone NDAs, churches can incorporate confidentiality provisions into employee handbooks or leadership agreements, focusing on specific areas like financial information or counseling records. Financial information, that's another one that we didn't hit up. And that is simply but because, like, let's say you are a deacon at that church and you see who's tithing how much money or who's giving how much money. That's something you probably need to keep quiet about because you don't want basically that kind of stuff to get out there that can cause embarrassment, things of that nature. Some people have more money than others, whatever the case may be. You don't want that out there. And other people start treating things differently. I knew a pastor at one time who purposely did not ever look at who was giving. There was a church secretary, and he would ask her basically not like who's giving how much, but like say when somebody was, I'm just going to go ahead and use this as an example. I was a deacon at this church, and to be a deacon or an elder at that church, they did want to see that you were, giving money to God. You were giving money to the church, to missions, things of that nature. They didn't put a price amount on it. They didn't do anything like that. They just wanted to know that their leadership is giving a biblical example and giving, what God has given them and giving it back. And the pastor purposely would not look at those things. Instead, he would ask the secretary, hey, Tim, does Tim give? Yes, he gives. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I needed to know. Moving back on to my notes, we have internal conflict resolution policies. Churches can adopt a conflict resolution policy that protects sensitive information without resorting, as you were, to NDAs. These policies can include mediation processes or committees tasked with addressing internal disputes in a transparent and accountable manner. And you also have ethical transparency policies. Churches can emphasize policies that encourage transparency, ethical leadership, and whistleblower protections, ensuring that NDAs are not used to suppress concerns about misconduct. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to some high-profile examples of what we've seen in NDA church kind of abuses that we've seen, because that's really where we see a lot of it. So one of the ones, and I think some of y'all are familiar with this, there was a church called Willow Creek, which was started by Bill Hybels. This church is being credited along with Saddleback Church with being really the start and the rise of the seeker-sensitive movement. Saddleback Church, which was pastored by Rick Warren, that was over on the West Coast, while Bill Hybels' church, Willow Creek, was kind of, it was in the Midwest, so the eastern side of the United States, really, but in the Midwest. And he got into a lot of trouble because there were some NDAs that were signed because he sadly had some SA accusations that were thrown against him. NDAs were signed. Several women accused him of very inappropriate behavior. And that led to an investigation and an eventual resignation. Some staff members and women who made allegations were reportedly asked to sign NDAs as a part of their severance agreements, restricting them from speaking publicly about the church's internal investigation and Hybels behavior. These NDAs became a point of controversy as critics accused the church of them using to silence whistleblowers and prevent victims from sharing their experiences. The use of the NDAs in this case caused backlash, with many calling it for greater transparency, and some of the women involved later chose to speak out despite the NDAs, leading to public discussions about the ethics of using confidentiality agreements in cases involving misconduct. So there's one right there. Another example, Hillsong Church, Brian Houston. There have been a couple different examples of this when it came out. Carl Lentz, the famous pastor who was fired from Hillsong after it was discovered that he was in an extramarital relationship with another woman. I think he had two actually, but I'm not positive on that. But he had an extramarital relationship. He got fired, and Hillsong forced him into signing an NDA. And he actually came out and admitted that Hillsong forced him to sign an NDA on what he was allowed and was not allowed to talk about and discuss and things of that nature. You also saw Hillsong trying to use an NDA. Now they refuted this, but you have a pastor's daughter who from Pennsylvania who went to Australia for a like a Hillsong conference thing, leadership. I don't know the exact situation around it. Basically, essay happened to her, and the church was trying to get her to sign an NDA to shut her up about it, and she obviously refused to sign. And that father was very adamant about that as well. So then, who knows what other NDAs might have been out there, but those are the ones, some public, that we know about. We also saw some stuff happen in the SBC, which is very, very sad. You know, a majority, the last church I was in was an SBC church. I agree with their mission, but they had some serious bad things happen. And there were, in some cases, survivors of that abuse, and staff members involved in the internal investigations were asked to sign NDAs as part of settlement agreements with the individual churches. Very, very sad situation. There was a lot of criticism that came out, and rightfully so, to the SBC for that. Another one you saw was Mars Hill Church. This was with Mark Driscoll. NDAs being used to sign with former staff members who were privy to the church's internal financial dealings and leadership decisions, not to mention the fact that they knew about Mark Devers, kind of crazy, overbearing, and I'm just going to kind of say hostile personality that he was known for, at least what it was reported to be. And then we see a few others, Harvest Bible Chapel, Illinois, USA. And we've even seen examples, like I mentioned before, Hillsong Church was using non-disclosure agreements with their staff and volunteers to not talk about Stephen Furtick. Saddleback Church, and mind you, now Rick Warren, I'm not a big fan of Rick Warren. Rick Warren did not like using NDAs. He actually put out there he didn't believe in NDAs. Well, that Rick Warren's not the pastor anymore. They hired on a pastor named Andy Wood. Andy Wood came on, and apparently Andy Wood had a bunch of people sign NDAs because he had some very abusive practices, at least alleged abusive practices, not sexually or anything like that, but just, spiritual and intimidating, type of abusive practices that he incorporated, and NDAs were apparently signed, or at least that's what he was being accused of. So that's, once again, Andy Wood over in Saddleback Church. And then, of course, IHOP KC, International House of Prayer, there were NDAs that were a part of that process, not just that process, but other things that have happened within IHOP KC. Now, those are just some examples. And I hope you can see now, if you were wondering what this was all about, if you weren't a fan of NDAs in the past, or if you were a fan, I hope you see how wrong it is that churches are trying to use NDAs to silence people when it comes to, honestly, any situation. You can't find an NDA where it would be justifiable to me. One, because, like I said, we go back to the counseling, the financial stuff. There's other things you can do. And usually we see the NDA as a very threatening type of legal document. D. Cole writes, we need to be weeping for victims of churches. Some real bad stuff going on. 100% right, D. Cole, 100% right. I appreciate y'all, and I love y'all, and I hope this video was insightful. Once again, if you are not subscribed, I highly encourage you to do that, because it does help in pushing this message out there, and I appreciate y'all. and I will see y'all on the next one.